Welcome back to Ton Does Linux and More. This week has been one of those classic Linux weeks where almost every corner of the ecosystem moved at the same time. We've got a Linux 7.0 release candidate that looks on track for the final release very soon. Arch Linux has pushed out a fresh April ISO with a newer installer. Artix is making some interesting stack changes for users who want a system-free setup. Steam on Linux has crossed a genuinely important milestone. And KDE has managed to land two very different but equally interesting stories in the same week. So in the next few minutes, I'll walk you through what changed, what actually matters, and where I think the practical impact is for real Linux users. And as always, I'll skip the fluff and focus on the updates that are actually worth your attention. Let's start with the biggest ecosystem level story, and that is Linux 7.0 release candidate 7. Linus Torvalds released the 7th release candidate during the past week, and the short version is that things still look on track for a stable Linux 7.0 release next weekend, assuming testing stays clean. In other words, we are now at the point where the conversation is shifting away from major features and toward the final round of polish and bug fixing. What stood out to me here is not some flashy headline feature. It's the kind of practical cleanup that tells you the kernel is nearing the finish line. This release candidate includes more graphics driver fixes, controller support updates, and a performance fix for Qualcomm and Atheros ATH11K and ATH12K Wi-Fi drivers. There is also an unusual but very 2026 detail in the mix: improved security documentation designed to help AI agents submit better bug and security reports. And honestly, that last point is interesting because it says a lot about where Linux development is right now. Even the kernel documentation process is adapting to the reality that more tooling, more automation, and more AI-assisted workflows are becoming part of development and testing. So while RC7 is not the release where you expect fireworks, it is the release where you look for confidence. And right now, Linux 7.0 looks confident. Next up, Arch Linux 2026.04.01 is out, and for Arch users, this is exactly the kind of ISO refresh that matters if you are doing a fresh install, setting up a new machine, or rebuilding a system. The April snapshot ships with Linux 6.19.10 and includes Archinstall 4.1, which is probably the more important part of the update for most people. Archinstall 4.1 now uses a new textual-based interface, which should make the installer feel more modern and easier to navigate. It also adds firewall zone support, improves handling for whole disk LUKS root parameters, supports grub UKI menu entries, and adds Galician language support. At the same time, it removes NTFS root file system support and drops the NVIDIA proprietary driver option because NVIDIA DKMS is no longer in the Arch repositories. For existing Arch users, this does not change the rolling release story. You still update as normal, but for anyone doing a clean deployment, this is a much nicer starting point than using an older ISO and pulling down a mountain of updates afterward. So this is not exciting in a dramatic way, but it is absolutely useful in a very real, very Arch kind of way. If Arch is the mainstream rolling release reference point, then Artix Linux 2026.04 is the more opinionated alternative story this week. Artix pushed out its first 2026 ISO refresh, and it includes some very visible defaults that make it stand out immediately. Most notably, it promotes XLibre instead of Xorg as the default display server, and it switches the default audio stack from Pulse Audio over to PipeWire. The release also ships with Linux 6.19 and updated desktop environments including KDE Plasma 6.6, XFCE 4.20, Cinnamon 6.6, LXQT 2.3, Mate 1.28, and LXDE 0.11.1. On top of that, users still get the multi-init system choice that defines Artix in the first place, with OpenRC, Dynit, S6, and Runit all in the mix. Now, Artix is never going to be a distro for everyone, and that is completely fine. The reason I think this release is worth mentioning is because it shows that Linux still has room for strong alternatives in system design. If your ideal Linux system is not just Arch, but slightly different, and instead you care deeply about init choice, service design, and keeping systems out of the picture, Artix is still very clearly building for you. Now let's talk about the number that will probably get the most attention outside the distro space, and that is Linux reaching 5.33% in Valve's March 2026 Steam survey. According to the numbers highlighted by Fornix, this is the first time Linux has crossed the 5% threshold in Steam's published data. It also places Linux at more than double macOS in that same snapshot, with macOS at 2.35%. There is an important caveat here, and we should be honest about it. Part of this jump appears to be connected to Valve correcting the Steam China language distribution data, so this is not a simple organic straight-line growth story. But even with that caveat, 5.33% is still a meaningful headline because it reflects the degree to which Linux games gaming is no longer a fringe curiosity. Steam Deck, SteamOS, Proton, better anti-cheat support in some titles, improved AMD driver experiences, and a much healthier overall Linux gaming stack have all changed the baseline. Phoronix also notes that roughly a quarter of Linux gamers in the March data were using SteamOS, which tells you just how central Valve's hardware and software ecosystem has become to Linux gaming adoption. So no, I would not frame this as Linux has won gaming. That would be silly, but I do think it is fair to say Linux gaming is now operating at a level of visibility and relevance that would have seemed unrealistic a few years ago. The next story is less flashy, but in some ways more important, especially if you care about reliability. KDE Linux, the project's in-house leading-edge distro for showcasing the latest Plasma work, spent part of the last month dealing with a serious issue involving its atomic update system. Some users ended up with unbootable systems, and the root of the problem was tied to a bug in System 260, where an update transfer could be skipped. That, in turn, could leave the machine trying to boot a non-existent OS image. The good news is that KDE Linux developers have now made changes to harden that process, including improvements to the update and rollback flow. The broader monthly update also mentions better ZRAM defaults, pre-installed USB MUXD for improved iPhone and iPad integration, support for mounting optical disc images, and a number of other fixes. This is one of those stories that probably will not get a dramatic thumbnail by itself, but it matters because it is about trust. Atomic update systems sound fantastic when everything works. The real test is what happens when something goes wrong. And to KDE's credit, this is exactly the kind of painful but necessary engineering work that makes a project better over time. And finally, we have the more fun KDE story this week. KDE developers are bringing back the classic Air look for the upcoming Plasma 6.7 cycle, while also giving the Oxygen theme a substantial modernization pass. If you have been around KDE for a long time, this one probably hits a nostalgic nerve immediately. The returning Air work includes improved transparency, blur behind windows, adaptive opacity, and a more refined panel design. Oxygen is also getting attention, including fixes for Wayland fractional scaling issues, new icons, better panel behavior, and general cleanup to make it feel less like a leftover and more like a maintained desktop option again. Plasma 6.7 is currently expected on June 16th, 2026. What I like about this story is that it is not just nostalgia for the sake of nostalgia. KDE is taking a classic visual identity and asking how it should behave on a modern Plasma desktop in 2026. That is a much better approach than simply shipping a retro skin and calling it a day. For long-time KDE users, this is going to feel familiar. For newer users, it is another reminder that Plasma still gives you a level of personality and visual flexibility that is hard to match elsewhere. So overall, the past week gave us a pretty well-rounded Linux snapshot. The kernel is almost at a major release. Arch and Artix both pushed meaningful ISO refreshes. Steam on Linux crossed a real psychological milestone, and KDE managed to deliver both reliability work and desktop polish in the same news cycle. If I had to pick the biggest story of the week, I'd probably say Linux 7.0 being this close to release matters most in the broad sense, but Steam crossing 5% is probably the story that says the most about how far Linux has come in the eyes of the wider tech world. Let me know in the comments which of these updates matters most to you. Is it Linux 7.0, the Arch and Artix changes, the KDE work, or the Steam milestone? And if you want more weekly Linux coverage like this, make sure you're subscribed to Tanda's Linux and More.